This is The Naked Life with Roxanne Noor. Hello, my dears. Thank you for tuning in today. I want to speak about an issue that's extremely polarized right now, especially in the United States, where the duality of things is very strong and also purposefully strong to kind of set people against each other. And I want to bring a kind of balance or a middle way into points of view that are really radicalized. And one of the main topics of debate is gender and the fluidity of gender, and even more so transgender people and their rights. There's like a really interesting dance that's going on constantly, and there's a symbolic meaning behind both parties. So there are the conservatives, and what do conservatives symbolize? They symbolize tradition, moving kind of slowly, not this like full force progression, but a kind of more grounded stance and a more rooted one into the past, basically. And the liberals are a kind of progress, but the thing with progress is if there's not a clear direction in terms of where we're moving and why we're moving, then the direction is almost meaningless. And so both parties are super necessary, but the views have become so radicalized and so extreme that it's actually difficult to have a conversation that includes listening to one another. One of the things I recently watched was What is a Woman? So it's a documentary made by a conservative called Matt Walsh. And in the beginning of the documentary, I felt almost resistance to it because I could see that he was going in with such a clear agenda that there wasn't a sense of wanting to understand the other side, but just disprove the other side. But as the documentary went on, I could see the reason for his stance. And that reason is actually rooted in a care and a goodness, but the way in which he communicates is so brute and so harsh and so decided that it makes it difficult to watch. So he speaks to people who study gender and ideology and people who are involved in vaginoplasty, doctors who help the transitional process for transgender people. And the thing with any industry is not to look at the people who are suffering from it, but the people that it profits. And in America, you are not allowed to drink a beer if you're 18 years old, but you can be a minor and you can make the decision to alter the body, and the side effects are huge. In countries like Finland and Sweden, they have actually banned puberty blockers and puberty inhibitors because of the prolonged risks that it has on children, to stop girls from getting their period. And the consequences have been things like spinal fracturing, and that's caused a lot of damage. And so the question is, what right does an individual have over their body and their bodily sovereignty? And in society, we're always trying to find this balance, and transgender people throughout history have been so overlooked, treated so poorly. They have had I mean, especially where I'm from in the United States, in New York, just a transgender person in the past getting a normal job was difficult because they were so discriminated against. And this forced them into kind of the underworld of sex work and getting money in different means. So they're in a usually lower class economically, socially. And now, because there's more and more people being open with it, there's this push for respect us, we are people. And all of that actually makes perfect sense to me. But what doesn't make sense is someone who is not fully developed. Before age 24, our brains are, we cannot make lifelong decisions. Most people have multiple different jobs that they're trying out. Like this is an age for experimentation, not for something that can completely be permanent and alter the composition of the body permanently. And so there is a way in which the people who are pushing these agendas and allowing minors to go through surgery that will alter the course of their lives, the people who are allowing it are the people who are profiting from it. And to me, that's scary. And it's also blatantly obvious the ways in which transgender people are being used as cash cows in the medical industry. And that is scary and threatening, especially when it's younger people. And Matt Walsh, I think that was towards the end of the documentary what he was trying to prove. The beginning of the documentary could have actually been interesting. He interviewed people who would be considered liberal, and there were conversations around the fact that there is gender. There's gender that is assigned. They use the word assigned at birth, but really also there's the biology. And the reason that conservatives get so angry is they believe that liberals are in a fundamental argument against reality. And we could go even further to say that if I was born in a body that I disagreed with, but it was given to me, that would just cause mental suffering and anguish, regardless of the society telling me that I'm wrong. So just the relationship with self that transgender people must have to feel like this is the body that life has given you and to want to completely alter it and change it, that in itself would cause suffering. And so looking from the outside in, I actually have compassion for that because that sounds sad and scary. But there's a whole other layer on top of it, which is when you look at some of the people who are the most confused about identity, are a lot of it is Generation Z. And Gen Z is the one who grew up with the internet. They grew up with looking at social media consistently and seeing all these contradictory notions on basically what it means to be a human and looking outward to the way other people are engaging with their gender, their sexuality. And that's already scary because that consistently looking outward is going to create this kind of confusion within self, regardless of anything else. So it actually makes sense to me that the people who are really wanting to transition the most are a product, a lot of the time, of a generation that grew up with the overload of information from the internet and from the web. So Generation Z is susceptible to all the media that is often contradictory, confusing, and it creates a kind of overwhelm. And there's been so many studies done with Generation Z in general that they suffer from an increase in depression and anxiety. And I don't think it's any coincidence that that's entangled in being so acutely involved in the web, in social media. So there's the conservative approach, which definitely has an ounce of truth in it, which is when people are younger, when you're a minor, there is naturally a confusion around identity, around why am I here, around existence itself. And then having the internet, which is pushing a certain agenda, is going to be even more suggestive to people. So if you're already unsure with who you are, there is a chance that seeing messages of people who are transitioning could plant ideas. That is a possibility. But then there's also the main argument that I can get behind, more than that one, because even that one's shaky, is the fact that the medical industry is using transitional therapies and the people and the minors as cash cows. So if you're profiting something, if you're profiting from a particular thing, you're going to push that thing because you have stakes in it. And this is what we see all the time. The side that liberals are pushing, which I would say in the past I actually would have said I am a liberal, and the more and more time has gone on, and especially post-pandemic, I can see that there are certain fractures in the thought and ideology and a kind of just following government blindly, which I don't agree with. But what I can agree with that the liberals are stating is how much women have suffered from gender. How much gender being so binary that women are supposed to do this, supposed to tend to the household, not supposed to work, all these really traditional notions, how that is a trap, and it's a trap in rigidity, and it's a trap that doesn't give the space of individuality that we are more than the gender that we have been born into. And it was Simone de Beauvoir who wrote The Second Sex, who said, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. We are trained into what it means to inhabit these bodies. And there is a huge suffering around that. And maybe not so much anymore in the West, where there is a lot of progress and women do have certain freedoms. But when you go into countries that still maintain very, very traditional notions around womanhood, you can see the way in which it's constricting and it's suffocating. And the same thing with men and masculinity. Men are suffering from the patriarchy as much as women are. They are so stressed with so many expectations. And this is also dangerous and sad. And so what I see is this interesting dance between conservatives wanting in some way truth, preservation of truth, that, okay, like we cannot go against our biology. And it's not that we're unequal, but that we actually should celebrate the differences that men and women have rather than pretending we have something that we don't. So for me, in the scope of my own life, there are certain traditional things that I adhere to because it makes sense, because of my persona, because of my individual gifts, because of the way I function. So in my relationship, I'm not the only one who's cooking all the time. It's dependent on how much my boyfriend is working, how much I'm working. It's dependent on who feels like cooking today. It's not like I just cook every single day because I'm the woman. And then around values of money and finances, because I love my femininity in being revolved around beauty and making things and not production and work and structure all the time, my boyfriend takes care of finances because it's in his specific nature, not just masculinity, but it's like what he actually enjoys doing and what he feels he's good at. And so we can all play with these notions of tradition, and then also these notions that liberals have, which is progress and flexibility. And so looking at both is interesting. I don't think it has to be one specific way, like I'm a liberal, so I do this, or I'm a conservative, and so I believe this. And what's sad about the documentary, What is a Woman, was the fact that Matt Walsh was going in with a lack of curiosity in understanding the other side, in seeing the ways in which trans people have suffered so much. And now for them, because there's so much visibility, is this reclamation of identity and self, and in a way that's beautiful. But the part that's not beautiful is the way in which medical industries are taking advantage of younger demographics of people. That is inherently dangerous. And so if his whole approach was rooted more in this curiosity for the other, in this care, the message would be easier to digest for liberals as well, rather than just being in an echo chamber of information for conservatives who already believe the same thing. And so the way an issue is approached is so important. And I think so many people who are not transphobic are scared to talk about transgender because of the whole cancel culture and because of the whole woke culture and anti-fascism, which ends up being fascist if you can't listen to someone. It's so obvious when someone's intention is rooted in hate and rooted in xenophobia versus when it's rooted in an actual concern. And I think with some of the whistleblowers who have come out from the medical industry, there is an actual concern for children and for trans people. A lot of the questions we should have should be around the way in which we can support one another. And so there's the conservative belief around, I don't want to use pronouns, that's not in my scope of reality. And then there's the liberal belief in wanting to support people in their message of identity. But the thing is, identity is something that is not fixed. It is in constant flux around the persona that is shape-shifting through the environment, essentially. And so what we're seeing is really radical changes within the last 3 to 4 years. And to me, it's just so obvious that it's this whole yearning for balance, for the fact that men and women have been so constricted around what their gender means that now there's such a want for this movement and this openness, and the ways in which that is actually beautiful, in my opinion, and necessary, but the ways in which it gets dangerous when huge parties intervene in it. So really looking at the medical industry with a sense of skepticism, looking at the way in which we speak to one another. And if conversations are just going to be calling each other names, like whatever Matthew says, like libtards or snowflakes, or if the liberals call the conservatives dinosaurs, like it's not getting anywhere. And so the main question is, why do people believe what they do, and how is it rooted in their own experience and in their own view of the world, and how those views of the world are just changing so radically. And we can either be completely opposed to it, or we can see the way in which the culture is changing around gender fluidity, and we can try to work with it and question it and see the beauty of certain paths and then the dangers and the perils. And so the conservatives and liberals are so necessary for one another. Like I'm happy actually that both sides exist and it makes sense to exist. But it's just scary when there's no sense of compassion or listening to one another. And so with the whole documentary, What is a Woman? I felt actually the sense of compassion to some sense that Matt Walsh had at the end, which is the fact that you want to protect children. And if a child in America can't have the autonomy to drink a beer, but they can completely change their whole body and their hormones and all these things, then regret it later on. That's scary. And so, yeah, I would just say these conversations are so sensitive because of the huge amount of suffering that trans people have gone through historically. And now seems like more than ever a time where it's celebrated to be different. And like, I think those differences are so interesting. So just leaving you all off with this note of how we can witness the differences of one another without going into narratives around what it means to be liberal or conservative, and really to look at both sides with a sense of curiosity. So, thank you.